Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to the Artsy Raven, and today our special guest is Brooks Kolb. Brooks was educated at the American College in Paris, University College London, and the University of Pennsylvania. At Penn, he trained under Ian McHarg, famed author of Design with Nature, and Laurie Olin, subject of the 2024 documentary Sitting Still. After coming out of the closet, he moved to San Francisco, where he witnessed two key periods of gay history: the post-Stonewall era of sexual liberation and the tragic AIDS epoch. The principal of Brooks Kolb Landscape Architecture and an avid swimmer, Brooks lives in Seattle with his husband, Dennis, and their dog, Stella. So welcome, Brooks.
Thank you.
You're an architect. Very interesting.
Landscape architect. There's a difference.
It pays better than writing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But can you tell me a little bit about yourself and how did you start writing?
Well, it's an interesting story. I wasn't expecting to write a memoir. It happened almost by accident. But to go back to tell you a little bit about myself, like you said in the bio, I'm a landscape architect. I trained at Penn under Ian McHarg and Laurie Olin, who has since become one of the most prominent landscape architects in the country. But all of the time that I was doing that, I felt like I had a divided self. I didn't feel like I was fully expressing who I was as a person. And because I was going through such a long period of academic rigor, I guess you'd say, that put off my coming out of the closet until I was 26 years old. So I felt like I was super overdeveloped as a career on my career side and completely undeveloped on my personal side. And actually, when I was preparing for this, I watched some of your earlier videos, and I watched a podcast that you did in the first season with Britt East. And I read his book, A Gay Man's Guide to Life, which was really wonderful. And in it, he made a really interesting statement. He said that a lot of gay people it's almost as if their adolescence is delayed by a decade or more because of trying to hide when you're in high school or something and not really knowing who you are or how to come out. And that was exactly what happened to me. So that's the background of the memoir. But how it happened was a complete accident. I even wrote about this on my blog. I was at the YMCA one time toweling off after swimming, and I overheard a guy in the locker room talking to a friend of his about how he had lived in London for a long time. And so then the guy walked over toward me, and his locker was near mine, and I said, "Oh, that's interesting. You lived in London. So did I." And I proceeded to tell him an anecdote of something that had happened to me in London, which is now 50 years ago. And he seemed interested. So I thought, oh, that was an interesting story that I told him. I realized I have a lot of other stories I could tell, and then I thought I should write a memoir. So I drove home thinking, oh, that might be interesting to write a memoir, but it was maybe almost 2 years before I realized what the memoir was really about and the gist of the story was really going to be.
Okay. Now, what was the biggest challenge in writing your memoir? Was it you had too many stories?
Maybe that's right. I don't know what I would have said if you hadn't prompted me to say that. Yes, there was a lot of material that hit the cutting room floor, you might say. And I worked with three developmental editors well, actually more than three. My head is kind of spinning about all the developmental editors I had. But it became very clear very fast that a lot of the material was completely superfluous to the main story. I just had to figure out what was the story, what were the anecdotes that centered it, and which were the ones that were completely, not really relevant to the main story.
So how have you been balancing being a landscape architect and writing? Like, are you still writing now or?
Well, I'm writing my blog. I'm writing my
Okay.
Substack. I think it would be fun to write another book, but I haven't had an idea for another book yet, so I'm mainly concentrating on my blog. And as to how I balance that with my life as a landscape architect, I'm mostly retired now, and I'm pretty much turning down jobs. So actually having the time to write the memoir as time went by. This was an 8-year project, by the way. I started in 2018. And when I started, I only had about an hour to write every evening. But then as time went by, I began transitioning toward retirement and had more time for it. And I became just so entranced by the writing. I even put in my blog how at one point I felt like I was living simultaneously in the 1980s and in the 2020s. And my partner Dennis would come into the room and tell me he was going out on an errand. And I was like, wait, I thought I was in 1984 right now. I didn't.
Who are you? Okay, can you give me a little bit of synopsis about landscape and lavender?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So the book begins, and in fact, when I do the reading, I'll read from the first chapter. I'll just hold up the book because it hasn't actually been published yet. It comes out on June 23rd. But and the I'll read when I get to the reading. I'll do a little bit of reading from the first chapters, mainly because the book hasn't come out yet. So the first half of the book is set in Philadelphia, where I got my 2 degrees, in my undergraduate degree and my graduate degree, and where I came out of the closet. And then the second half of the book is set in San Francisco because I mentioned that I had a conflict between my personal identity and my professional identity, and that conflict became more and more stressful to me as I was approaching the end of my time in Philadelphia. And one day I went into a travel agency and I saw a huge poster of the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. And I thought, oh, I remember visiting San Francisco when I was 13 and I loved it. I think I want to move there. And at the time, there were thousands of young gay men moving from all across the country to San Francisco for gay freedom. I would say that LGBT freedom was a lot more restricted to a few places in the country at that time. Now it's widespread throughout the country, which is wonderful. But at the time, there were 2 or 3 meccas, you might say, and San Francisco was the primary one in America. New York also, of course, but the difference in New York was at the time, back in the 1980s, um, the sort of zeitgeist or the vibe was that you were closeted at work in New York, whereas in San Francisco it was more usual or normal to be out of the closet both at work and in your personal life. And that was what I was seeking, a way of being out both as in my personal life and in my professional life. But I think you asked a different question. I'm not sure if I really answered your question
It's okay. I'm like, what did I ask you?
there.
It's all right. No, I was thinking about how, like, I read somewhere about how, like, someone realized that LGBTQ was more mainstream after they saw Target was selling flags during
Yeah,
Pride.
yes,
They're like, we
exactly.
made it. We're at Target.
Yeah, if we're in Target, we're everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, now, like, I had gotten a bunch of questions, so I don't know if, you wanted to answer some of these, but like, there was one that I thought was sort of interesting. Not too many people think about like AIDS, like now isn't as, how do you say, as scary as it was back then.
Yeah.
So, like, do you remember what it was like back then?
Well,
Like,
absolutely. That became another driver of the story. So I moved to San Francisco to find gay freedom.
mhm,
And then, as I mentioned at the beginning of part 2, when I moved to San Francisco, the year was 1982. It was not even 4 years after Harvey Milk had been assassinated in City Hall, along with Mayor George Moscone. And that incident, the assassination, is what launched the political career of Dianne Feinstein, who immediately became mayor. And so, right after Harvey Milk was assassinated, there were a number of candlelight marches down Market Street in San Francisco, which have been documented. I mean, there's been a documentary about that, but also the film Milk, starring Sean Penn. So I arrived in San Francisco 4 years after that, or not quite 4 years after that. And as I mentioned at the beginning of part 2, AIDS was like a freight train that was on the, but it was on the very distant horizon, and it had a cyclops eye to it, and that freight train was just starting to barrel toward us, but it was so far on the horizon that it wasn't especially worrisome, in the sense that you didn't know how much to worry about it. It was really a lot like at the beginning of COVID, when everyone was wondering,
Mm,
well, is it really serious, or is it
yeah.
just like a flu, or how bad is this? Well, COVID came on so quickly. AIDS did not come on as quickly. I mean, it did start quickly, but it was a while. It was maybe 4 or 5 years before it became a major killer. It was just killing a few people at a time at first. And so then when I moved to San Francisco for gay freedom, suddenly, or gradually, I guess I would say, AIDS became more and more part of the picture, and it became harder and harder to avoid. And I described the sadness I felt, of losing that sense of freedom that I had moved to San Francisco for, because of AIDS. But at the time, I thought, oh, this is not going to affect me. This is not going to affect me. But as you'll find when you read the memoir, it came as close to me as it possibly could without killing me. And so I wanted to write a memoir that told the story of my partner, James, who died of AIDS. And, you know, at the time, no one person who died of AIDS really was celebrated, because there was not time to celebrate any one person. There were so many people dying at once that no one person really got the
Recognition. Or,
recognition. Thank you, the recognition that they were due. And I wanted to tell a story that was about one person who died of AIDS, and what that meant to me, and what that meant to his family, his friends, and all his loved ones.
oh, that's
But that's
beautiful.
just part of the story of Landscape
Yeah.
in Lavender. It's not primarily an AIDS memoir, it's partially an AIDS memoir.
Okay. Now, although I know like a lot of LGBTQ stuff is more out in the open, what kind of invisible or impediments or they're invisible have kept people from coming out even in this day and age, do you think?
I'm glad you used the word invisible, because my second chapter is called Invisible Dragons. And actually that came out of a discussion I had with my first developmental editor. She said, Brooks, in order to tell a story, you have to have a hero who slays dragons. And I'm not seeing any dragons here, because at the time I was kind of jotting down my memories, and things tended to turn out well for me. And so I was maybe overemphasizing how things had turned out well, and there was very little narrative tension there. So she said, Brooks, you've got to have some dragons to slay. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized, oh well, my dragons were invisible. My dragons were homophobia, of course,
Mm.
but the homophobia was not overt. I describe in a chapter called Invisible Dragons how my parents were quite liberal, and they had sort of, in their generation, they had gone away from the Protestant churches they grew up in Montana, because they felt that those churches were places where people were just gossiping about each other, and backstabbing each other behind the scenes type of thing. And so they had a very secular attitude in my upbringing, and I didn't feel any overt homophobia. But as I describe in the memoir, I felt like homophobia and racism were coming out in the water that poured out of a faucet. They were in the air, they were in the water, they were in the air. They were just invisible to me.
Okay. Now let's switch gears a bit. Like for anyone that wants to write, and they're in a similar situation or they're a new writer, like what advice do you have to give them?
Don't give up. Be perseverant.
Okay.
I mean, I had no idea when I started writing how many writers there are. I had no idea how, I actually thought there were more landscape architects in the world than there are writers. Boy, was I wrong. Everyone's mother, their dad, and their their cat and their dog. They're all writers, and I didn't realize that at first. And it's an art form, and so it's very hard to make money on an art form. But that doesn't mean that the art forms are not relevant. They are extremely relevant. I have, for example, a sister-in-law who's a theater person. She's an actor and a director, and she's struggled to make a living doing that. But all of the wonderful things in our cultural life tend not to be profitable except for a very few. So the advice I would have to people starting out as I did, just suddenly deciding to write at age, what I guess I was 65 at the time, um, is to don't give up, and you will find a way of getting your story out into the world. I I read or heard many people talking about how important it was to get your story out in the world. And I think it was Maya Angelou who said something like, if you don't get your story out into the world, it's something like it's almost worse than worth worst almost worse than death or something like that. I can't remember the exact quote, but her point was it becomes urgent to get that story out into the world, and you failed yourself if you don't do it. So I would say be persistent and go for it.
Okay, now you're going to do a reading for us. So can you give us a bit of context and then you can start reading?
Oh, okay. Are we already there? Wow, this has gone fast. Yes. Okay. So the context is I'm going to read from the first chapter. The first chapter is called Urban Cowboy. And in order to set the scene, um, you have to know that I just had graduated from Penn with my landscape architecture degree. And I had just found an apartment in Center City, Philadelphia, which was away from the Penn campus. And that gave me my opportunity to mingle with people that were not 100% other Penn students and professors and staff at the University of Pennsylvania. The year was 1980, and John Travolta's new movie, Urban Cowboy, had recently caused a sensation, compelling thousands of young men to don Western gear. On my frequent trips to New York to visit undergraduate friends who had moved there, I kept passing myriad cowboy boutiques that had sprung up on the Upper West Side as suddenly as wildflowers in a meadow, each one stocked floor to ceiling with shelf upon shelf of pointed toe, high-heeled Nakonas and Tony Lamas. The boots came in all the colors of the rainbow, and the sales clerks relied on wooden library ladders to reach the highest shelves. The shops were veritable candy stores, and the more often I passed them, the more obsessed I became. I had to have those boots. I wanted a different pair for every night of the week. Fashionable cowboy boutiques, excuse me. Fashionable cowboy boutiques had yet to infiltrate staid old Philly, but the windows of a menswear store on Chestnut Street had recently been dressed in a Western theme. When I entered the store, ranks of tables covered with the usual boring corduroy pants rose up to insult me. Where was the cowboy gear? Cursing myself for not having bought my hat and boots in New York, I negotiated the maze of aisles until at last I spied one or two in a distant corner. Just as I reached out to stroke the soft velvet of a Stetson, hypnotized by its sensuousness, a salesman sidled up. Dressed in a cheap suit, an Oxford button-down shirt, and a loosely knotted tie, he broke the spell with a high-pitched lisp that made me wince. May I help you? I'm just looking. Where's the dressing room? The preppy salesman waved a limp hand toward a nearby hallway with a row of cubicles. Thanks. A cloud of cologne lingered in the air while I quickly grabbed the closest hat and boots and headed off. Drawing the dressing room curtain tight, I sighed with relief at my newfound privacy. After stroking the boots with reverence, I pulled one on, then the other. In the full-length mirror, I kicked one foot back, the better to admire my new heels. Then I put on the hat, slowly lifting my head until I met my own eyes under the shadow of its brim. Adopting my most smoldering expression, I stared at myself for as long as I dared. At last, in a state of excitement, I nodded to myself. I looked great in my perfect new cowboy outfit. I hastened out of the dressing room, ready to pay for my new identity. I'll wear these out the door, I told the salesman as I reached into my wallet.
Of course, sir, he replied, ever the Nelly faithful servant. But when I strutted out onto Chestnut Street, traffic whizzed by in a cacophony of horns, shattering my fantasy of the wide open plains. What did the urban and urban cowboy mean? I wasn't sure. Would a cowboy hail a cab? I was fairly certain he would. Suddenly, a childhood memory came to me in a jolt. Although the scene was now frozen in amber, more like the memory of a memory, I still remember how on my second birthday my father had unexpectedly lifted me up and placed me on top of a tall bookshelf. Leaning against the wall in Dad's arms, I felt as if I were perched on a cliff. All at once, Dad placed a large box on my lap, opened the lid, and pushed away the flaps of white tissue. Inside, I beheld a beautiful cowboy hat, a tiny pair of boots, a red kerchief, and suede chaps. I instantly adored my new cowboy suit, but just as Dad started pulling the boots on my feet, I heard him saying, "Of course, you're not a real cowboy. Real cowboys ride horses, but they're ignorant and they spit, and they rope calves. Do you know how to rope a calf?" "No," I said in my shyest little boy voice. Boorish as they may have been, according to my dad, I already dimly knew that cowboys were heroes who could do exciting, manly things that I could not. The message I got, now firmly implanted in my psyche, was that I was not a real man, maybe not even a real boy. As much as I wanted to dress up in the outfit, Dad's belittling words made me feel phony. Like my mother, I had a truthful disposition and couldn't begin to fake it. Dreading to be unmasked as an imposter, I was too shy to put on the suit, so it went back into its box, never to reemerge. Now I was reliving that painful drama in the busy traffic of Chestnut Street. Didn't sporting the hat and boots mean that the world would see me exactly the way I viewed the salesman, as a pathetic sissy? With my vivid and overactive imagination, he felt like a red flag in my path. Wasn't he a warning that if I ever dared to consider coming out of the closet, I would turn into a limp-wristed, lisping old homo as surely as Cinderella's coach turned into a pumpkin at midnight? Also, why had I bought a brown hat? Clearly, a black one was much cooler. Even in my desire to sport a theatrical new outfit, I had opted for the less flashy headgear. South Street was a vibrant fashion boulevard, tailor-made for sporting a cowboy suit with pride. But so deep was my shame at not being a real cowboy that I didn't dare face the glances of its hip and stylish pedestrians. Afraid of being mocked, I detoured 2 blocks south to Maidridge Street, in the no man's land between Center City and South Philly, where I was much less likely to be seen and scrutinized. Night had fallen, and when I turned the corner into the shadows of Bainbridge, I hung my head as I clip-clopped toward my apartment. In a flash, 2 young black men ran toward me from out of nowhere and flanked me on both sides. Before I had a chance to look at their faces in the dim light of one far-off street lamp, they grabbed my wrists. "Give us your money." I could almost feel their hearts beating as I hastily reached into my pocket to pull out my wallet. Roughly shoving me, they ran off without another word, disappearing as suddenly as they had appeared. They didn't threaten me with knives, or worse yet, pull out a gun. They didn't have to, because in my panic, I was so quick to hand over my wallet. I was panting now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Patting my chest and empty pockets to confirm that I was still all in one piece, I hurried home. Was this what the Italian lady's evil eye had dialed up for me? Never had I felt so vulnerable and dejected, but somehow I couldn't be angry with the 2 youths. So intensely did I absorb their fear while they accosted me. Although nothing had betrayed their emotions, I was convinced they were as scared of robbing me as I was afraid that they might stab me. The main thing I felt was more shame. Shame that I hadn't tried to defend myself, and shame for wearing a hat I hadn't earned. More than anything, my failure to fight back proved once and for all that Dad was right. I was no more than a fake cowboy. Back in my dark, forlorn apartment, I pulled the window shade down and brooded. Donning boots and a cowboy hat made me feel like I was in drag, but that didn't mean I was consigned to wear them without pride. That was my choice, and it had turned out to be a bad one. If only I had assumed the role of a proud cowboy, holding my head high and parading down South Street as nonchalantly as if I were wearing a business suit, I never would have been held up. Shaking off my reverie, I called the police. I assumed they would be bored by this latest routine crime in one of America's most crime-ridden cities. But to my surprise, the cop listened to my story with relish. No more than 10 minutes later, a police van idled noisily in the narrow street outside my apartment, siren wailing. Banging loudly on my door, a burly white cop led me downstairs to identify my assailants. Out on the street, I was nearly blinded by the flashing red lights on the van's roof. The double back doors opened, and down a metal ramp came 5 slim young black men in handcuffs, roughly jostled by the cop's partner, who shoved them into a line. No older than 18 or 20, all 5 stood before me shaking in fear. Dressed in tank tops and backward baseball caps, I saw them for the kids they were. "Are any of these the guys who assaulted you?" asked the first cop. No, I can't be sure," I said, squinting in the bright red light as my voice trailed off. 2 of them might have been, but it was equally possible that none of them were. They had surrounded me so quickly that I never got a chance to look at their faces. The first cop glared at me with pure contempt while his partner frowned and folded his arms. "Sorry," my voice cracked. I didn't know what else to say, so I watched as the 2 men reluctantly herded the boys back into the van, slammed the doors shut, and drove off. In my confusion, I couldn't understand why the cops were so hostile. But when I returned to the forced solitude of my apartment and closed the door, it dawned on me that both officers were angry that I had squandered their perfect opportunity to shove 2 young black men in jail. Although nobody spoke of white privilege in those days, I got the distinct impression that not only did I possess it, but the cops were counting on me to exploit it, no matter how indiscriminately. My failure to please them rattled me even more than the holdup, almost as if I were the one who had committed the crime. Nor did I feel any calmer when, turning on the lights, I realized that the 5 suspects now knew where I lived. Reflecting on this incident in the weeks to come, I ruminated about how cut off I was from Philadelphia's vast Black population. And then I mentioned that I went into a number of record stores and found a fantastic series of R&B artists to listen to, and they gave me more of a sense of connection to the Black community, making me feel like I belonged to the wider city.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing. But that sounds very frightening, actually. I've never been held up before, so I can't imagine. But thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much, JF. I really appreciate it.
The Artsy Raven is produced by Dark Helix Press. Introduction voiceover by Chris Gorman. Music by Tim Moore. Please access your bonus content on the Patreon website. Thank you very much for listening, and please stay safe.